All right, so welcome to the lesson 2 of our Agile Scrum Master Certification training. So once again, my name is Obalim, and I'm going to be your anchor person for this particular course. So here we're going to be taking a look at Scrum roles. Within the Scrum framework, we have what we refer to as roles. And when we talk about roles simply refers to those who will be accountable. Accountable simply means those who should ensure that certain things are done, certain events are carried out, certain activities are done within the Scrum framework. And that's what we refer to as the Scrum role. So part of the agenda we're going to be taking a look at in this lesson, of course, would include the role of your stakeholders, then also the role of the product owner. We shall also take a look at how the product owner prioritizes product backlog. Then we shall also take a look at the role of the Scrum Master, and then also talk about the Scrum team. We shall also take a look at what we refer to as self-managed teams, basically with a particular emphasis on developers. Then we're also going to talk about Manager 2.0, and then also other specialist roles that you may have within the Scrum environment. So we hope to cover all of these in various stages in the course of this particular session. So once again, I welcome you to my class. First, let's talk about stakeholders. When we talk about stakeholders, stakeholder is anybody whose interest is positively or negatively affected by the project, or who can exert an influence on the project. So in a nutshell, we can simply say that stakeholders are folks who are either interested in our project or involved in our project, or maybe impacted by our project. And those are folks whom we refer to as stakeholders. So within the Scrum, there are those whom we refer to as stakeholders, mostly those who are outside of the Scrum team. Of course, when we talk about Scrum team is usually made up of three major components, which are the role of the Scrum Master, then the role of the product owner, as well as the role of the developers. So these are those who actually make up the Scrum team. So that's exactly what we're talking about here. So that the Scrum team is basically made up of the product owner, the Scrum Master, and then, of course, the developers. So if you take a look at our definition of stakeholders, stakeholders are those who are either interested, involved, or impacted in our project. So you can see that the Scrum team, which of course is made up of the Scrum Master, the product owner, and the developer, they are involved in the project. So they also make up what we refer to as our stakeholders. So they are part of stakeholders because the Scrum team is actually part of the project itself. In fact, they are the ones who are directly involved in the project. And then you also have your management, your customer, your end user. These folks may fall under those who have vested interest in the project, either by virtue of investment, say, for example, management or customer, as the case may be, or who may be impacted by the project, either by virtue of the fact that they will be the ones to use the end product or the final resulting outcome of that particular initiative or project. Aside from that, your vendor as well, including your contractors or your external contributors, basically your suppliers too, they also refer to as your stakeholders. And then also people whose roles are displaced or affected. So in essence, we talked about those who may be impacted, and we also refer to them as stakeholders. So in a nutshell, stakeholders are folks who are either impacted, interested, or involved in our project. So within the Scrum framework, the Scrum team itself, the Scrum team is at the core or at the heart of the Scrum implementation of the Scrum project. So every other stakeholder or every other interest that is outside of the Scrum team is typically now referred to as stakeholders. So what that means is, for example, if the Scrum team is interacting with management or with the customer or with the end user or contractor, as the case may be, the Scrum team looks at it from the perspective that these are stakeholders. So in a nutshell, what we're simply saying here is, whenever you're taking a look at the Scrum methodology, you will talk about the Scrum team. And then, of course, those who are outside of those Scrum team, in most cases, we now refer to them as your stakeholders. So if, for example, you have a request coming from a customer, this is treated as a request coming from a stakeholder. Or you have a request coming from management, this is treated as a request coming from a stakeholder. And that's essentially the essence of your stakeholders. This is, of course, now referred to as your stakeholders. So the key thing here is, why is it important to manage stakeholders? Well, this is absolutely necessary because any stakeholder we fail to identify within our project and determine how best to manage the stakeholder will cause us the most headache in the project. And that's part of the reason why stakeholders management is absolutely necessary, no matter the type of project, especially as it pertains to Scrum projects. So to effectively manage our stakeholders, these are some of the steps that we will take. First, we need to do what we call stakeholder identification. So you begin by identifying who are your stakeholders. And then there are a couple of tools and techniques you can actually use to do your stakeholder identification. We can use what we refer to as the onion diagram. So onion diagram is a stakeholder identification tool that helps us to do a comprehensive identification of our stakeholders, where you begin by talking about, remember I talked about the Scrum team. So you have the team itself, who are those responsible for the development of the product itself. And then outside of the Scrum team, we may now talk about another area of stakeholders, which of course might include the domain, unit, or function where we are carrying out the function. Say, for example, the IT department. And then outside of it, you may now have maybe a wider scope, which of course here we may refer to this as the organization in total. And then you can now also have a bigger circle, which of course may now represent your external stakeholders, say for example, the regulators, the government, and the rest of them. So you can see, if you're using an onion diagram actually helps you to do your stakeholder identification. So once you've done your stakeholders identification, the next step is you assess their knowledge as well as their skills. So assessing the knowledge and skills of stakeholders help you to effectively determine where to place your stakeholders, which of course would also inform how you'll be able to manage the stakeholders. Then you analyze the need of the stakeholders and make sure that the project, in order to ensure that the project is able to meet their needs. This is also one of the key things you do during your stakeholders management process. And then of course you get and keep them involved by assigning them work, using them as experts, reporting to them, involving them in changes, as well as lessons learned. So we need to effectively now begin to manage our stakeholders effectively. So if you notice, key things we have done here in stakeholders management includes the identify stakeholders process, where we come up with a list of our stakeholders, and then we now assess their knowledge and then also analyze the project to ensure that their needs are met. So in essence, after we have identified our stakeholders, we now do what we refer to as stakeholder analysis. So analysis is where we essentially do the assessment and then also determine how the project would be able to meet the needs of our stakeholders. So after that, we now, of course, begin to engage our stakeholders. So engaging our stakeholders come in various shapes. We can, of course, keep them involved, maybe by assigning them work to do or using them as experts where necessary. We can also be reporting to them, depending on the frequency of the report, and then also involve them in changes as well as in lessons learned. The idea is, in order to effectively manage our stakeholders, we need to essentially determine what their needs are and then put measures in place to meet those needs or to adequately address them. And then other ways you can also engage and manage your stakeholders would include getting their sign-off and formal acceptance during closure. Then, of course, the final part, which is about establishing a rapport with them. Like I mentioned earlier, any stakeholder we fail to identify and then, of course, put measures in place to be able to handle will cause us the most headache in the project. So that's part of the reason why building rapport with your stakeholder is absolutely necessary. Determining effectively how you're going to manage them and then also how you would ensure that they stay committed to the project is one of the key things that typically within the Scrum framework, we don't treat lightly. There was a particular case study I read about a very popular magazine. And then, of course, there's this investor who came and bought over that particular magazine. And then at the end of the day, there were a set of stakeholders who referred to themselves as minority shareholders in that particular organization. So they took the investor to court. And the reason why they took the investor to court, according to them, was because of the fact that the transaction was concluded without their interest as well as their involvement. So at the end of the day, the court actually gave a verdict that that particular transaction should be rescinded. And of course, it's null and void. So this to tell you the impact that stakeholders can actually have, and that proper engagement would help your project succeed. But if you don't do proper engagement with your stakeholders, in many cases, this would adversely affect your project. So while carrying out your Scrum project, it is quite imminent that you try as much as possible to engage your stakeholders effectively. And then, of course, as we journey along, we'll see those various roles that you have within the Scrum framework, and then the responsibility that they have towards your project stakeholders. I'll see you in the next lesson. Thank you. Okay, welcome back. So remember, we're still taking a look at Scrum roles, and we're taking a look at the role of the stakeholders, which of course we talked about in the previous part. Here, we're going to be taking a look at Scrum lifecycle. Now, the Scrum lifecycle actually explains the whole concept of the Scrum methodology. So this will give you an understanding of what happens during Scrum. And then with this lifecycle, we're going to explain every other thing we're going to be discussing throughout the duration of this training. So say, for example, we have a project to implement and want to develop a communication tool that we're going to be using within the office in order to enable us effectively communicate with one another. So, for example, staff members need to be able to effectively communicate with one another and want to develop a communication tool, or let's say app, to be able to do that. And so one of the very key things we need to first of all do is to gather or do elicitation. Elicitation is basically a process of gathering requirements from relevant stakeholders. Of course, remember, stakeholders could be our end users. They could be those who are within the organization, and then also those who one way or the other may be impacted or involved in this particular initiative. Say, for example, our management, and then also members of the Scrum team. These are part of the things we discussed in the previous part. So here, after we have gotten our requirements, those requirements now form what we refer to as our product backlog. So product backlog is simply a list of requirements that we have chosen to work on within the project itself. In essence, this represents the features or things that we're going to accomplish within the project. Those are now what makes up the product backlog. So the product backlog is typically made up of your requirements. And then, of course, these requirements can come in different shades. It can be what we may refer to as functional requirements, which may refer to the core of the product itself, or non-functional requirements, which of course may now refer to as to some other, things that support the functional requirement, especially coming from the development team or maybe from the Scrum team, as the case may be. And then it can also be in form of a user story, which of course represents a description of those requirements, as the case may be. We're going to take a look at user stories much more later, so you see essentially how user stories are developed. But please note that user stories is a way of representing requirements in a readable and then also most understandable and concise and complete format in order for us to effectively be able to implement it within the project itself. So each of these items you have within the product backlog is referred to as your product backlog item, your product backlog item. And from what I've said so far, we can deduce that product backlog items can either be user stories, they can be your requirements, it can be your both functional and non-functional. They can also be improvements. Say, for example, we have finished a particular Scrum, we've done retrospectives, and there are certain improvements that we have identified, and we decide to add them into the product backlog. So all of this now makes up what we refer to as the product backlog. And then we decide to add them into the product backlog. So each item in the product backlog is what we now refer to as the product backlog item. So if you remember when I was talking about the requirement elicitation, I did explain that we gather requirements from relevant stakeholders, and that's exactly what you're seeing here. Those who will give us input, of course, especially as it pertains to those requirements, can include our customers, the team, managers, and then executives. This list is not exhaustive. They can also include our end users, and then also those who one way or the other may have some level of interest within this particular initiative or project itself. So I know that some of us may be asking, so are we not going to be taking every requirement from every Tom, Dick, and Harry? No. Of course, sometimes within projects, you have the role of a business analyst, who is more like the person responsible for elicitation and requirements management. So the BA does the elicitation, gathers these requirements, and then, of course, refines those requirements, and then comes up with what we may refer to as our red hot requirements. So those red hot requirements are now the requirements that now goes into the product backlog, which of course is now handed over to the product owner. So the role of the product owner is basically to manage these items that you have within the product backlog. So it can be said that the product owner simply manages the product backlog. So of course, I have a course on business analysis. So just in case you're interested, you can also check on this platform. It's one of the top selling courses on this platform, and you can of course take it just in case you want to learn about business analysis. However, remember, we're still discussing Scrum. So I've just talked about the product backlog, and I did explain that the product backlog is simply all the product backlog items that we need to implement within a particular project, as the case may be. So judging from this communication tool that we're developing, say for example, we want to develop the product backlog. So product backlog, of course, would now include all those items that we have gathered in the course of the requirement elicitation, either from the business analyst or any other stakeholder who is involved in that particular process. And so let's assume that some of the requirements we've gathered for this particular communication tool are: one, we should be able to chat with one another using the tool. Then we should also be able to call one another. I'll refer to that as voice call. Then we should also be able to do video call. Then also, there's also another requirement for conference call. And then also we should be able to share files. And then, of course, encryption, because this is an organization, so we want to protect our information. So encryption was also a major requirement that was gathered as part of the requirements for this communication tool. Then other requirements that we also gathered included ability to perform incognito chat. Okay, so these were some of the requirements that we have gathered. So I'm going to call these requirements 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7. Each of these items is now what we refer to as the product backlog item. And then all of it put together is what we refer to as the product backlog. So that's our product backlog. All our product backlog items put together, in this case, for our communication app. So this particular product backlog item is now, of course, handled or managed by the product owner. So the product owner is responsible for managing the items in the product backlog, prioritizing them, and then also effectively determines what goes in and then also what goes out of this particular product backlog. Of course, don't forget that this product backlog will keep being updated and then also being refined until we have been able to accomplish the goal of that particular project or the objective of the initiative itself. And that's part of the key things that happens, especially with the product backlog. Now, once we have been able to develop the product backlog, then from this particular product backlog, we now select items that we're going to be working within every sprint. So sprint simply means a short duration within which we must achieve a working software, or what we may refer to as a product increment. And that's what we refer to as a sprint. So let's say in order to be able to develop this communication app, we come up with a couple of sprints. Okay, we'll say, okay, we're going to be breaking it down into a sprint, and then we're going to be running a 2-week sprint. So we have a 2-week sprint for this particular purpose. So the 2 weeks simply represents the duration of the sprint. And then, of course, we can run multiple 2-week sprints until we've been able to accomplish all of these items that you have within the user story. So you have our sprint 1 here, which lasts for 2 weeks. Then these are sprint 2, which also lasts for 2 weeks. And then you may also have your sprint 3, which may also last for another 2 weeks. And then sprint 4, up until we've been able to accomplish all the items that you have within the product backlog. So during each of these sprints, remember, like I explained, the goal is to have a working software or a product increment. So at the end of the very first sprint, we must have a communication app, even if it doesn't contain all of these features, but then it must be seen to be working, and then also be able to at least perform one or more of these features or functions that we have within the product backlog. So in order to be able to determine which items we're going to work on each sprint, we now need to do what we call prioritization. The product owner does the prioritization. And the essence of the prioritization is to determine what we call a minimum viable product or minimum marketable feature. So the minimum viable product or the minimum marketable feature simply represents those features that, of course, mean so much to the organization and has the highest value to the organization. And those are the things that make up the minimum viable product or the minimum marketable feature. So the product owner will prioritize all the items that you have within the product backlog. And then, of course, from this, we now begin to pull it into the sprint and begin to implement it one sprint after another. So let's assume this is the order of prioritization as was done by the product owner. And then the team now has what we refer to as a velocity. Velocity simply means how much work the team can accomplish within a particular sprint. That's what we refer to as velocity. So in the very first sprint, we can use what we call a commitment-driven velocity. So a commitment-driven velocity simply means that the team can take a look at the product backlog items and say, okay, within this particular sprint, we're going to be able to accomplish this and then also be able to accomplish this. So let's say within the sprint 1, the Scrum team has selected to accomplish user stories 1 and 2. Of course, don't forget that it may really not flow in that chronological order, but then I'm just keeping it simple for you to be able to appreciate and understand it. So it therefore means that at the end of sprint 1, we must have a working software that is able to perform chatting. In other words, we can chat with the application, and then also we can do voice call. Then in sprint 2, let's also assume that the Scrum team now chooses to implement features 3 and 4. So in essence, in sprint 2, you have the features 3 and then also feature 4. So it means that by the end of the second sprint, in addition to voice call, chat, we should also have video call as well as conference call integrated within this communication app. So that's now what we call the product increment. So as we do and develop each of these features, we're also integrating them so that they form a unit or they form a system that, of course, represents a part of the product, which, of course, we're going to be building incrementally. And then, of course, let's now say in sprint 3, the team agrees to work on user story 5 and then also user story 6. So in essence, they work on 5 and 6 in this particular sprint. So by the end of the third sprint, our communication app would have from features 1 up until feature 6. So that's also another product increment. And then maybe in the fourth sprint, we now work on feature 7. And then if we're able to now accomplish the product goal, which of course basically represents the vision or the reason why we decided to do that particular project, then it effectively brings the project to an end. So this is the idea of what to refer to as sprint. Of course, working software, and then also product increment. Now, in order to be able to do this, we have the role of the Scrum Master. So the Scrum Master is the servant leader for the project itself. And this person is responsible for ensuring that as much as possible, we abide by the Scrum framework. This person coaches, this person also facilitates and trains where necessary. And most importantly, the Scrum Master helps the team in removing obstacles or any impediments that they may face in the course of carrying out their daily work. Then we now have the development team, which of course, for short, is known as the developers. So we're going to be referring to this group of persons as the developers. So the developers are now those who will be responsible for carrying out the task that you have within each of these sprints. So remember, I said in sprint 1, we're going to do features 1 and 2. So the developers are now the people, the set of people who will now come up with those features 1 and 2. And then developers are typically cross-functional. So they can be made up of course, just like the name sounds, developers. So when we talk about developers within Scrum, we're not just talking about programmers, because that's usually the assumption that people make whenever they hear the term developers. No. So you're not just talking about programmers. They can also include your testers, your UI, UX designer, and then also any other person who has a relevant skill that can contribute to that particular work package, that can contribute to that particular product backlog item, and then any other function or role that we need to be able to implement that particular product backlog item. And those are the persons who actually make up the developers. So developers, like I did explain, will be responsible for now doing this implementation. And then in the course of doing the implementation during the sprint, the developers will hold what we refer to as daily stand-up meeting, also known as daily Scrum meeting. So the daily Scrum meeting is a 15 minutes meeting that the developers hold on a daily basis to determine the development flow. In other words, what has been accomplished, then also what challenges they may be having in the course of carrying out their work, and then if there are any impediments, they also report that to the Scrum Master. Remember, I mentioned that one of the key responsibilities of the Scrum Master is helping to remove those impediments. So those are the key things that are usually discussed during the daily Scrum. And then at the end of the daily Scrum, the team goes back to their responsibility and then, of course, begin to carry out the task as they have actually determined. So we have talked about the role of the product owner. We have also talked about the role of the Scrum Master. And then we have also just talked about the role of the developers. So these product backlog items that we have talked about that we're going to be implementing within each of these sprints is now what we refer to as our sprint backlog. So when we talk about the sprint backlog simply refers to the product backlog items that we have chosen to implement within the sprint within each of the sprint. And then typically this sprint backlog is now broken down into what we refer to as tasks. And these tasks are now the tasks that are carried out by the developers on a day-to-day basis. And that's exactly what we have been able to point out here. So remember, we have talked about the product backlog, then also we've talked about the sprint backlog. So while the product backlog represents all the user stories that we need to accomplish within a particular project in order to achieve the product vision, the sprint backlog represents the user stories that we need to accomplish within each sprint of our project in order to enable us to meet the sprint goal. So before the start of each sprint, usually the Scrum team does what we refer to as the sprint planning. So the sprint planning is where the team determines what is going to be accomplished in that particular sprint. So in essence, this is basically where we come up with the sprint goal. And that's what happens during the sprint planning. And then at the sprint planning stage, the key things that the team is able to arrive at are the what. In other words, what are the user stories that we need to implement within that particular sprint? Then the how. How do we break it down into tasks? And then the why. Why are we choosing those particular set of user stories, and what impact will they have on the overall product vision? Those are the things that actually determines what we're. So these are the things that actually now make up what we now refer to as our sprint goal. Now, at the end of the sprint itself, we now hold what we call the sprint review. So the sprint review is where the Scrum team now comes together to determine effectively how we have. So in a nutshell, we began with inputs from our customers, teams, and then, of course, managers who gave us requirements. And those requirements were captured within the product backlog, which, of course, is what you have here. And then we now, and we said that the product owner is responsible for managing items that you have within the product backlog. And then we now carry out the sprint planning. During the sprint planning, we selected the specific set of product backlog items we're going to accomplish within each sprint, and then broke them down into tasks. and then of course created our sprint backlog. Then as we now implement each sprint, which is basically what we're running here, we do what we call a daily stand-up meeting. So the daily stand-up meeting is our daily scrum. So during the daily scrum, we effectively discuss the development flow. So at the end of it all, once we have been able to now finish that particular sprint, we do what we refer to as sprint review. So the sprint review is basically where we carry out a demonstration session, but of course it goes beyond just demonstration. So it is where we do a review of the sprint and then also gather relevant feedback. So here, one of the key things you do here, so one of the things you do here during the sprint review is you demonstrate the completed work product and then gather relevant feedback from your stakeholders with regards to the tool or functionality. Of course, don't forget, we said at every sprint, you must have a working software or a product, increment. So by the time we're done with that particular sprint, we need to do what we call a sprint review, where we demonstrate this working software or increment, and then, of course, determine effectively how they work, then gather relevant feedbacks. So once that has been completed, then we now do what we refer to as the sprint retrospective. So the sprint retrospective is where the team now comes together to do a soul searching. In essence, part of the key things we do here is we do lessons learned. And another key objective here is this is where we determine improvement. In essence, how can we improve going forward in subsequent sprints? That's essentially what improvement here actually portends or suggests. So during the sprint review, some of the questions that you ask during the sprint review are, what are the things we got right in this sprint? What are the things we did not get right? And then if we were to do this again, how would we do it better? So if we put this in summary, it therefore means that within the Scrum framework, we have what we refer to as the Scrum roles, which of course includes the role of the product owner, the role of the developers, which is of course what we have here, the role of the developers, and then we also have the role of the Scrum Master. So those are the three roles that you have within the Scrum framework: the role of the product owner, the Scrum Master, and then the developers. We also have what we refer to as Scrum event or Scrum ceremonies. And the key ceremonies that we have within Scrum are, we have the sprint planning, then we also have the daily Scrum, we also have the sprint review, and then we have the sprint retrospectives. Then we also have what we now call Scrum artifact. So Scrum artifact includes your product backlog, then your sprint backlog, and your product backlog items. So in essence, each of these items that you have within the product backlog, they also form part of your artifact. The sprint backlog, and then the increments. If you remember, I said that the goal of every sprint should be that we must have a working software or an increment. So that increment, together with the sprint backlog and the product backlog, is now what makes up what we may refer to as our Scrum artifact. So this, in a nutshell, gives us a picture of what we're going to be taking a look at as we journey along, from the Scrum roles to, of course, the Scrum ceremonies or events, then also the Scrum artifacts, and then also we're going to be covering other topics as we evolve. So in the next lesson, we're going to focus primarily on the role of the product owner, so you understand essentially what role the product owner plays within the Scrum framework. Thank you so much for watching. Okay, welcome back. So taking a look at the role of the product owner. So remember, we took a look at this particular diagram when we talked about the Scrum lifecycle in the last lesson. So here we're going to take a look at specifically the role of the product owner. So this is one of the most critical roles that you have in Scrum. And the product owner is part of the Scrum team. Remember, I did explain there are three key, parts of the Scrum team, which are the product owner, the Scrum Master, and then, of course, the developers. So these three makes up what we refer to as the Scrum team. So always note that. So anytime we use the word Scrum team, don't forget Scrum team is made up of the product owner, the Scrum Master, and then the developer. So that's why here we mentioned that the Scrum team is also made up of the Scrum Master and then also the developers. So the product owner provides the direction to the team. So key thing that the product owner does, the product owner is the holder of the vision for the particular product. So that's why this person is referred to as the product owner. In many cases, the product owner represents the interest of the customer. So that's why, if you notice, one of the 4 Agile manifesto says customer collaboration over contract negotiation. I explained that to mean that within the Scrum framework, we bring in the customer as an integral part of the team. And that particular customer, who is an integral part of the team, is the product owner. So in essence, the product owner represents the interest of the customer, or within the Scrum framework, the context of the customer is basically represented by the product owner. Obviously, as the customer, one of the key things you always want to accomplish is value maximization. And then value maximization can be in terms of profitability, return on investment, or it could also be some other value, which of course may not be in financial or monetary terms. Say, for example, this project is to eradicate polio. So if that's the case, the polio disease, prevalence of such polio disease within every particular location might also be a way of measuring value, or to improve the number of enrollments of the girl child in schools. Okay, so depending on how many enrollments we've been able to generate over time, that can also be a realization of value. Value realization can also include increasing customer satisfaction level, enhancing already existing services. All of these can, of course, be ways you can maximize value. So we're simply saying that value realization is not just necessarily measured in terms of how much is in it for us. So the product owner manages the project's return on investment and then also risk. And then, of course, builds the business case for projects and features, and also be cognizant of the risk. These are ways that the product owner manages the project's return on investment as well as risk. So when we talk about the business case is basically where you have the justification for the project itself. That's what's contained in the business case. So this justification is absolutely necessary because this is what helps us to be able to determine if it makes business sense for us to undertake the project in the first place. Then the product owner takes input from all stakeholders about what the team should do. So in many cases, the product owner actually interacts with stakeholders. Remember, I had earlier defined stakeholders and I said folks who are outside of the Scrum team make up our stakeholders. Say, for example, managers, department heads, the senior management, end users within the organization, of course, other suppliers, as the case may be. These represent stakeholders. So within the Scrum framework, in order to effectively manage the stakeholders, the core responsibility of stakeholder management actually lies with the product owner. The product owner translates these into what we refer to as backlog. So remember in the previous slide, I talked about the product backlog, and I said input into the product backlog in many cases come from our stakeholders. So that's exactly what we're saying here. Customers, your team, your managers, your executive, they bring input, which now goes into the product backlog. And then the product owner assigns priority to items in the product backlog. Within the product backlog, you have some set of items, which of course are referred to as the product backlog item. Remember, in the last exercise I used, so say, for example, we have items A, B, C, D, as well as E, and then F within the product backlog. Remember, each of these items is our product backlog item, which of course represent features that we need to accomplish within the product itself, which of course represent features that will need to be included within the product of the project itself. So the product owner assigns priority to these items and determines, okay, we're going to implement this first based on value, and then this would come next. So that's essentially what we mean by priority. And then also determines the release plan with help of the team. So these are some of the responsibilities of the product owner. Beyond this, other responsibilities of the product owner would include to communicate the plan, as well as roadmap with external stakeholders. Roadmap simply means how all the things we're going to be accomplishing within the project, they refer to as the roadmap itself. So if you remember that communication app that we're talking about, in the communication app, we have already itemized a set of requirements that this app would, of course, meet. So the process of accomplishing each of these requirements from the very first to the very last one represents the roadmap. So the stakeholder constantly keeps in touch with how well we have been able to accomplish this set of features, and then also if we are on course towards accomplishing the product goal. The product owner also participates in Scrum meetings. For example, the release as well as sprint planning. The product owner is actually an integral part of this, especially the sprint planning, because the product owner is there to make clarifications and then also explain where there are complexities about a particular product backlog item. The product owner also takes part in the sprint review. Remember, I talked about 4 major ceremonies that are carried out within the Scrum environment, which are the sprint planning, then the daily Scrum. We also talked about the sprint review as well as the sprint retrospectives. So the sprint planning as well as the sprint review are major ceremonies that the product owner should, of course, attend. The sprint planning is where we determine what to do within that particular sprint, the how, and then the why. So the why is explained by the product owner, and that's why you need the product owner during the sprint planning. Then the sprint review is where we determine what we did correctly, what we did not do correctly, and then improvements that we should make. So typically, it is the Scrum team that takes part in the sprint review. The Scrum team, of course, remember, is made up of the product owner, the Scrum master, and then the developers. So during the sprint review, this is now where the team determines how to build consistent increase or how to build consistent improvement in subsequent sprints. Then the product owner is also available to the team for clarifying requirements. So if there's need to clarify requirements, then the product owner also is available to do that, answer certain questions around requirements, and then also provide relevant feedbacks where necessary. These are some of the key functions that the product owner actually performs, especially within the Scrum environment. So next, we're going to be taking a look at prioritization, which is the major function of the product owner, and then steps that can be taken in carrying out prioritization. Okay, welcome back. So taking a look at prioritization. Prioritization is one of the major function or role of the product owner. So remember, we're talking about the product owner in the previous video. So here, we'll take a look at prioritization and effectively how the product owner does prioritization. So when we talk about prioritizing, another word we can use for prioritization is ranking. So this is basically where we decide to rank items in the product backlog according to priorities depending on value. So prioritizing requirement is an important role played by the product owner. And prioritization is essential to ensure that the available time and budget is spent on delivering whatever is most valuable to the customer. So the key word here is valuable. So in essence, in prioritization, we're determining what is most valuable, and that at every point in time, that which is most valuable is what is delivered to the customer. Remember, we mentioned minimum marketable feature or minimum viable product. So this is also another way of talking about most valuable items that we need to deliver to the customer. So what are some of the bases for justification, especially when it comes to prioritization? The basis for prioritization could be new revenue. So if a particular feature can, of course, give rise or give us new revenue, that can also be a basis for prioritizing that particular new feature. Another basis for prioritizing could be incremental revenue. So this means that probably we're already achieving revenue with that particular solution, and then implementing this would, of course, increase the value delivery. Also, it could also be based on operational efficiency. So this means enhancing already existing processes that we may already have within the organization, and then catch up with competitor. This can also be another possible justification for features, and then the reason why we need to prioritize such features that you may have within the product backlog. So in order to do revenue as well as incremental revenue analysis, we now do what we refer to as cost-benefit analysis. So cost-benefit analysis is a tool that the product owner also uses to determine value realization. So the cost-benefit analysis helps the product owner to define the investment time frame, for example, using what we call payback period, also forecast investment needed and then the recurring cost of such investment, then also forecast financial benefits that such an investment can give us, then use time value of money and a combination of measures to decide. So this is basically a tool that the product owner can use in being able to decide on justification for a particular feature, and beyond that, also the prioritization for that particular feature. So one of it, of course, is the payback period. So payback period essentially measures how long it will take us to recoup an investment. That's what payback period measures. So within a payback period, let's say, for example, we want to invest in developing an app, and this app will be used for trading cryptocurrencies. And that's exactly what we are hoping to implement. So in order to determine the justification, one thing that we can do as the product owner to do this is to do what we call a payback period. So payback period will now determine what is initial capital outlay. Initial capital outlay simply means how much will it cost us to develop this app. So let's say it's going to cost us about $10,000 to develop the app. That's our initial capital outlay. Then we now determine, okay, based on transactions and projected earnings per annum, how long would it take us to recoup this amount? So in order to do that, we need to come up with what we may now refer to as our cash flow. So cash flow simply refers to projected earnings per annum. So cash flow simply means the expected revenue we hope to derive on an annual basis by developing this application or coming up with this particular product. So if, for example, we have reasonably estimated that in the following years, year one, total revenue will be something around, say, for example, $3,000. And then for year two, total revenue would be around $3,500 because we expect increased users. And then for year three, total revenue would now be $4,000 in that particular order. And then, of course, in year four, we're hoping that total revenue will now jump to about $5,000. So this is the projected cash flow. So from this cash flow, we now determine at what point in time we'll be able to recoup our initial capital outlay, which is $10,000. So if our initial capital outlay is $10,000 and we want to recoup this $10,000, we want to determine exactly when we shall be able to recoup it. So remember, at the end of year one, the revenue or projected revenue is $3,000. So if you take away the $3,000 from the $10,000, you'll be left with $7,000 to recoup at the end of year one. Then in year two, the projected revenue is $3,500. So again, we deduct $3,500 from $7,000. So it means at the end of year two, we'll have about $3,500 yet to repay or yet to recoup. Then in year four, then in year three, we now make $4,000. So if we take away the $4,000 from the 3,500, it means that at a point in year three, we're going to be able to recoup this $3,500. So to determine that point, you simply divide the 3,500. So it's going to be 3,500 divided by 4,000, which of course is the estimated revenue for year three, and then you multiply it by the number of months. So if we say 3,500 divided by 4,000 times 12, this would give us 10.5. In essence, 10 and a half. So it simply means we're going to be able to recoup our investment in 2 years, 10.5 months. In essence, we're going to be able to recoup our investment in 2 years, 10 months, and 2 weeks. That's how long it's going to take us to recoup this investment. So this is how you calculate payback period. The decision rule for payback period is if you're comparing between two projects, you select the project that has a lower payback period. So let's say, for example, we're comparing two projects and the second project has a payback period of 4 years, for example. If that's the case, then of course we select the first project because that project has a lower payback period, and that's the decision rule for payback period. Now, other than payback period, there's also what we refer to as net present value. So net present value is also another decision rule or technique that we can, of course, adopt in order to also decide whether it makes business sense for us to undertake an investment. So if you're using the net present value, you're putting into consideration what we may refer to as the time value of money, which, of course, gives you an idea of how let's say interest rate, for example, can affect the value of money, and then over time can also affect how much that we are going to be raising. So if we're doing the net present value, so first of all, we need to determine the discounted rates for all of these figures that we have here. And then the formula for our discount rate is our present value is our future value divided by 1 plus interest rate raised to power n, when n represents the number of years. So don't forget, these are all projected cash flows, the 3,000, the 3,500, the 4,000, and then the 5,000. All of these are all projected cash flows, in essence, at the end of year one. So this is what we're hoping to make sometime in future. So if we now discount it, in other words, bring it to today's value, because we want to compare it with $10,000, which we are investing in today's value. So it only makes sense that all of these cash projections should also be evaluated using today's value. And that's essentially where net present value comes in. So you use this formula, future value is into 1 plus interest rate raised to power n. So for year one, don't forget our n is the number of years, while the I represents the interest rate. So let's say, for example, we're in an economy where you have a 10% interest rate. So the interest rate is 10%. So year one will now be 3,000 divided by 1 plus 10% is 0.1 raised to power n. For year one, that will be 1. Year two will be 3,500 divided by 1 plus 0.1 raised to power 2. Year three will be 4,000 divided by 1 plus 0.1 raised to power 3. And then year four would be 5,000 divided by 1 plus 0.1 raised to power 5. So if you work out this, for year one, you're going to be getting 2,727. And then for year two, the figure we'll get for year two will be 2,892.6 approximately. And then if we do for year three will give us 3,005.3. And then year four would give us, sorry, this is year four and this is raised to power 4, not 5, sorry. And the value we'll have for year four will be 3,415.1. So in essence, if we discount these values, the 3,000, the discounted value at 10% interest rate in year one is 2,725. For the 3,500, the discounted value in 2 years is 2,892.6. And then for 4,000, the discounted value in at 10% is for 3 years is 3,005. And then for 5,000, the discounted value for 4 years at 10% interest rate is 3,415. So if we sum it all up, this would give us 12,039.96 thereabout, approximately. So in essence, the discounted value of the sum total of this cash flow is around 12,039.96. So if we want to now determine the real net value that, of course, this investment would give us, what we now need to do is we subtract the 10,000 from the sum total. So this would now be your 12,039.96 minus 10,000. And then, of course, at the end of the day, we're going to be arriving at 2039.96. So the decision rule again for the net present value is you select the project that has the higher net present value. So in essence, for this, the net present value is about 2039.96. If we're comparing between two projects, in order to select the higher one, if we're comparing between two projects, you need to select the one that has a higher net present value. Please note that we're just doing this for academic purpose and then also just to show you how you can do this. Otherwise, there are smart tools like your Excel and then also some other computing devices that can help you in doing this computation once you feed in this data, and you don't need to know them for the purpose of the Scrum certification. You can also use the internal rate of return. The internal rate of return also, the decision rule is you choose the project that has the higher internal rate of return. So the cost-benefit analysis basically is a technique that helps especially in project selection. So this would help you to determine, okay, which initiative would make sense for us to undertake in the first place. So once you've now selected the project and then you now have your product backlog items, in order to prioritize items in your product backlog, there are a series of techniques that we can, of course, use to do that prioritization. So the cost-benefit analysis that we have just done helps us to effectively prioritize projects. So we use this majorly for project prioritization. So once a project has been prioritized and selected, and then we now begin to run the Scrum framework or implement it using Scrum, there will now be a need for us to, of course, prioritize items that you have in the product backlog. And then prioritizing those items we have in the product backlog, there are a couple of tools we can use for those prioritization, and we're going to be taking a look at them in the next video. Thank you so much for watching. Okay, welcome back. So, other than using the cost-benefit analysis, which of course included the payback period, the net present value, as well as the internal rate of return to do our prioritization, we can also do what we call the risk value analysis. So risk value analysis is also a way of prioritizing using risk and then, of course, value realization. So this can be used to prioritize project. It can also be used to prioritize requirements that you have within your project. So using the risk value analysis, we simply have 4 different quadrants here, which of course I'm going to term quadrant A, then also quadrant B, then this is quadrant C, and this is quadrant D. So quadrant A represents requirements that have high value, but then low risk. Then quadrant B represents requirements that have both high value as well as high risk. Then quadrant C represents requirements that have low value but high risk. So quadrant C represents requirements that have low value but then high risk. And then quadrant D represents requirements that have both low value and low risk. So as a product owner, if you're using this as a basis for prioritization, the idea is this: prioritize items that have high value and low risk and do them first. So in essence, items or requirements that should come first in your priority list should be requirements that have high value and low risk of accomplishment. Then after that, the next one that should come in that priority would be items that have high value and high risk. And that's the one that should be done next. Then the one that should now be done last should be items that have low value and low risk. And the ones we should not do at all are items that have low value and then at the same time, they also have high risk. So this actually gives you a tool for prioritizing your requirements based on value and risk. Other than that, there are also other tools that we can use for prioritizing. One of it is the Moscow method. Moscow simply means must have. Then the S there stands for should have. The C there stands for could have. And then the W stands for won't have. So must have are your top priority items. In other words, the product must have this set of features. I'll say, for example, for our communication app, there are certain must-haves there. For example, since it's a communication tool, you should be able to chat, that is text. You should also be able to call. Okay, so those are what we may refer to as must-have. Then should have are the set of requirements that come next to must-have. The should haves are also important, but may not be as important as the must haves. Say, for example, other features like video calling, conference calling. Well, some of us may refer to that as should have, and for some, it may be a must have. So, depending on the value placed on this by the organization. Then we now have could have. So, could have is also referred to as nice to have. So, these are features that delight, that basically add to the already must-haves as well as should-have. For example, the interface, the feel, the look, all of these are part of what we may now refer to as the could-have. And then there's also the won't-have. So won't-have are features that must not be implemented. So again, if you compare this to the value and risk metrics, remember we had quadrant A, quadrant B, quadrant C, and then quadrant D. And we said quadrant A are more like must have. So in essence, they have high value and low risk. Then quadrant B are more like your should have. They have high value and then high risk. Then quadrant D are like your could have. They have low value and low risk. And then quadrant C are now like your won't have. They have high risk, they have low value, and then they have high risk. So, I mean, this is if you want to do an association, but then other than that, we can just do our prioritization using the Moscow method. Then other than that, there's also the Kano model. Kano basically is the name of the Japanese guy who came up with this prioritization technique. So the full name is Professor Noriaki Kano. So he tries to fulfill requirements and then also please customers. So using the Kano model, there are what we refer to as thresholds. Thresholds are synonymous to must-have. Then we also have what we refer to as the linear features. So linear features are more like our should-have. And then we now have our exciters and delighters. So the exciters as well as delighters are more like nice to have. That is could have. And that's the essence of the exciters and delighters. So what Professor Noriaki Kano is simply saying is we have the must-haves, which of course are the threshold. That's the basic needs or hygiene needs. So in essence, this is what every customer expects a product should have. That's what you call must-have. So for example, if I come in and turn on my switch light, I expect lights to come on. And that's a typical example of must-have. So if it meets that requirement, I'll say, okay, this is a good switch because it's working effectively. I'm probably not going to be so much excited about it because that's what I expect it to do. So that's what we refer to as threshold. Now, beyond the threshold, we have what we refer to as linear. So in essence, linear features are those features that, of course, correlate effectively with the amount of satisfaction that the customer gets. In essence, the higher the linear feature, the higher the level of satisfaction. So all of this falls under what we refer to as linear. So say, for example, availability. Then, of course, the fact that that particular product lasts for a very long time, all of this can be referred to as linear features. So it increases the level of satisfaction based on the fact that the more we add it, the more customers get satisfied. So if we add additional features, for example, encryption, we add additional features like file sharing, we add additional features like ability to react to certain messages using emojis. These are certain levels of performance enhancement. So they can fall under what we call linear functions or linear feature, as the case may be. Then you now have what we call your delighters. So at the level of delighters, those are features that provide a greater level of satisfaction. So in many cases, price premium is added to such a product, but then lack of such exciter does not in any way decrease customer satisfaction below certain level. So in essence, customers can still fully enjoy the benefit of such a product even without the exciters. Well, that's essentially where the exciters or delighters feature comes in. So if we put this in context, the four components of the Kano model are the threshold or the must-haves. So those are things that must be present in the product for it to be successful. That's what we refer to as the must-haves. Then the linear feature, they are those features where customer satisfaction is correlated linearly with the quantity of the feature. So the higher the linear feature, the higher the level of satisfaction. Then we now have exciters and delighters. So those are features that provide great satisfaction, often adding a price premium to a product, but the lack of exciter or delighter will not decrease customer satisfaction below neutral. So we have taken a look at the Moscow model. We have also taken a look at the Kano model, and then also the risk value method as basis for prioritizing product backlog items. So all of these are basically prioritization techniques that the product owner can, of course, utilize to prioritize items that you have within the product backlog. So here we've taken a look at the role of the product owner. And in summary, we said the product owner is the value maximizer for the project. And some of the functions that the product owner fulfills within the project, of course, would include managing the project's return on investment and risk, and then also taking inputs from stakeholders about what the team should do and translating it into the product backlog, and then assigning priorities to items that you have within the product backlog, communicating the roadmap, the product roadmap with the external stakeholders, and then, of course, prioritizing items that you have within the product backlog. And then we also took a look at certain tools that the product owner can use to prioritize items in the product backlog. In the next lesson, we're going to be taking a look at the role of the Scrum Master. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next lesson. All right, so welcome back. So here we're going to be taking a look at the role of the Scrum Master. You remember our Scrum life cycle, where we did explain that there are three major roles in Scrum, which is the role of the product owner, which we took a look at in the last lesson, the developers, we're still going to talk about this, and then also the role of the Scrum Master. So the role of the Scrum Master is essentially what we're going to be talking about now. In the course of the introduction, we'll talk briefly about the Scrum Master, and we said the major responsibility of the Scrum Master is to help the team to remove impediments. Impediments, of course, could be obstacles or anything that may be militating against the team and preventing them from actually realizing whatever they want to accomplish within the project itself. So that's the core responsibility of the Scrum Master. However, beyond that, we're also going to take a look at some other role that the Scrum Master plays, especially within a Scrum project. So the Scrum Master is a critical role in the methodology. The Scrum Master helps the team achieve its goal by doing the following. These are the things that the Scrum Master actually accomplishes. One, serving the team. So the Scrum Master is a servant leader. The Scrum Master is a servant leader. And I'll explain the concept of servant leadership much more later. Then also protecting the team. When we talk about protecting the team, we're basically talking about making sure that the team does not have unnecessary interferences or disturbances. And then also helping the team resolve conflicts or helping resolve conflict, especially within the team itself. So the Scrum Master tries to facilitate a cordial working environment, ensures that as much as possible, conflict is eliminated or reduced to its barest minimum, and then also ensures that the team is not being interfered with either by other stakeholders or any other external, stakeholder. Then the Scrum Master also supports the team's use of Scrum. What I mean by that is the Scrum Master is a person who actually tries to ensure that as much as possible, the Scrum framework is adopted in its right approach, and then also supports the team in the usage of the Scrum framework. What that means is the Scrum Master trains, coaches, teaches, and then explains to the team where necessary about the idea of Scrum and how best to utilize Scrum. So those are key things that the Scrum Master actually does. Aside from that, let's know that the role of the Scrum Master is not synonymous with the role of a project manager. Because many times when we talk about Scrum Master, people look at it from the project manager's perspective. No. Within the Scrum framework, we do not have anything like the role of a project manager. So the project manager's tasks and responsibilities are distributed amongst the team. That is the Scrum team, including the product owner, the Scrum Master, and then the developer. However, if you're running a traditional approach and you have a project manager and you want to begin to use the Scrum method, then the project manager can become a Scrum Master, but then has to drop those paraphernalias that come with the office of project manager. In other words, within the Scrum framework, the Scrum Master may not direct, the Scrum Master may not manage the team or be a task driver or the person who assigns tasks to the team, no, which is, of course, typically what a project manager does. So as much as possible, this responsibility should, of course, be treated with caution and then also in line with the Scrum recommendations. So we're now going to take a look at in detail what exactly the Scrum Master does. Now, these are key things that the Scrum Master does. Remember, we said the Scrum Master serves the team, protects the team, and then supports the team's use of Scrum. So in terms of serving the team, activities that the Scrum Master performs to effectively serve the team are: the Scrum Master facilitates the team's interactions. And that means the Scrum Master organizes the Scrum rituals as well as other meetings. Scrum rituals are those Scrum events or ceremonies that I talked about, which of course includes the sprint planning, then also the daily Scrum, the sprint review, and then the sprint retrospectives. So this set of ceremonies typically is actually organized by the Scrum Master. Then the Scrum Master also removes the obstacles that are blocking the team. So if the team basically is undergoing any challenge or obstacle, it is your core responsibility as a Scrum Master to help the team in removing those blockers. Then, of course, the Scrum Master protects the team, and in doing so, protects the team from interference and disturbances. These interference and disturbances, of course, can include interference from external stakeholders, and then also resolves conflicts. These are ways that the Scrum Master protects the team. Then the Scrum Master supports the team's use of Scrum by providing process guidance, sharing best practices, as well as templates, and then also audits the methodology to be able to determine if it is used correctly, and then may stand in for the product owner in the absence of the product owner. These are ways that the Scrum Master supports the team. So training, coaching, teaching, and then also throwing light where necessary are part of the thing that the Scrum Master does actually to support the team. And so remember, I used the concept of the servant leadership. And servant leadership is predicated on the fact that even though figuratively speaking, the Scrum Master serves as the leader of the team, but then also at the same time, the Scrum Master leads the team by actually serving the team. And that's where removal of obstacle comes in. You know how it is said that the greatest amongst you shall be your servant. So in this case, also, the Scrum Master, who is the leader of the team, is also the servant of the team by helping the team remove obstacles where necessary and basically doing everything within his purview to ensure that the team is protected and they're able to carry out their functions within the stipulated time limits. So now that we have taken a look at what the Scrum Master does, it's also necessary to talk about what the Scrum Master should not do. So the Scrum Master should not manage the team. The Scrum team is a self-managed team. Self-managed team in the sense that the team decides based on consensus where necessary to take whatever step or measures that is needed. So usually decisions within the team is based on consensus, and it is usually done by the team. So that's why it is referred to as a self-managed, self-organized team. Therefore, the Scrum Master should not manage the team. The Scrum Master also should not direct the team members. So it's not within the purview or responsibility of the Scrum Master to direct the team members on what to do and what work not to do. So again, the Scrum team is a self-organized team. So the developers who do the work come up with the estimate, and they decide how best to do the work, how much work they can do within a particular time, that is sprint, and then also how to carry out the task itself. The Scrum Master should also not assign tasks. It's not the responsibility of the Scrum Master to come and say, okay, you do this today, and then this is what you will do today. Again, this is left to the team. So the development team decides effectively how to carry out their task. Scrum Master is also not a team driver. So you're not the person to drive the team or give instructions or maybe punishments, and then also put in place other things that we usually see in management. And then the Scrum Master also does not make decisions on behalf of the team. The team should always decide collectively how best to take decisions. And then also the Scrum Master should not overrule team members, and then also should not direct product strategy. So these are things we should be aware of, in essence, to be able to clearly define the limits of the Scrum Master. The idea is this, that people are humans, not resources. If you notice, in some project management methodology, people or human beings are classified as resources. And then because of that, not much attention is paid to the well-being of people, and then also to be able to determine what people actually think about their work, and then also how best to be able to implement it. So since Agile focuses on creativity, and that humans, of course, like to be creative, and then also that when asked to do so, humans can self-organize and determine how best to carry out an objective. And that's essentially what Scrum came in to do. So nobody gives directives here. Nobody does task assignment here. Everything is done based on the determination of the team itself. So here we're taking a look at the role of the Scrum Master, and we saw that the Scrum Master performs three major functions within the Scrum environment. One is to serve the team, and serving the team simply means becoming a servant leader, facilitating team interactions, and then also making sure that Scrum rituals are held. Then protecting the team from undue interferences and disturbances, and then of course supporting the teams in the use of Scrum by teaching, coaching, facilitating, and helping the team understand the Scrum framework. And then we also took a look at what the Scrum Master should not do. These include managing the team, directing the team members, assigning tasks, driving the team, and then also directing product strategy. These were the things we took a look at in this very lesson. Thank you so much for watching. And then in the next lesson, we're now going to take a look at the role of the developers. See you in the next lesson. Okay, so welcome back. So remember, in the last lesson, we took a look at the role of the Scrum Master. So in this lesson, we're now going to talk about the role of the developers, which of course we now make it the three key roles that we have in Scrum. Remember I said in Scrum, the key three roles are the role of the product owner, the Scrum Master, and then the developer. Let's note that the developers are basically those who are responsible for carrying out the specific activities that you have within the Scrum. So each member of the team is called a developer. So it doesn't matter what you do within that particular team, whether you are a programmer, whether you are a tester, whether you're a designer, whatever role you play within that particular team, you are referred to as a developer. So of course, don't forget, the developer is different from the Scrum Master, and then also different from the product owner. However, if this set of individuals have the relevant skill set, they can also be developers. So say, for example, a software developer who is a member of the development team or part of the developers can, of course, double as a Scrum Master as well. So they all contribute to the development of the product, and it is always necessary that a developer should be a generalist. So in essence, in Scrum, we prefer a programmer who can test, or we prefer a programmer who knows how to test and then also design, or a software engineer who also knows how to test and then also how to design, or a designer who also knows how to code and how to test. That's what we mean by generalist. This is quite necessary because the Scrum is a self-sustaining team and should be able to carry out its work using the skill set and capabilities and competencies of members that we have within that particular team, which of course is the developers. So it is usually recommended that the developers should be a small team, ideally 7 plus or minus 2. Don't forget that totally the maximum number a Scrum team can be is 10. Remember, when we talk about Scrum team is made up of the product owner, the Scrum Master, and then, of course, the developers. So in total, a Scrum team must not exceed a maximum of 10. Now, out of these 10, we can have one product owner, one Scrum Master, and then 8 developers. You can also have 7 developers, 6 developers, 5 developers. So that's why we said developers can be 7 plus or minus 2. If you also listen attentively, remember I said the Scrum Master can also be a developer. So it means you can actually have up to 9 developers and then 1 product owner. Now, out of these 9 developers, one of whom will now be a Scrum Master. So that's exactly how we arrive at 7 plus or minus 2. So the team is cross-functional. Cross-functional simply means that they should have all the skills necessary to deliver value to the customer. So the team should have all the necessary skills that they need to be able to actually implement that particular product backlog item. And then also the team is self-managing, which of course I've been talking about repeatedly, that the developer or the development team is actually a self-managed team. Please, let's understand that in the current version of the Scrum Guide, this is known as developers, and in many cases, it is no longer referred to as the team because a couple of times it is mistaken for the Scrum team. So that's why we're going to be using developer to consistently address those who are involved in the development. So in order to effectively build our developers, these are some of the factors you need to put it into consideration. Understand that your developers need to collaborate. There has to be so much collaboration amongst your developers. I mean, this is in line with the very first Agile manifesto, which of course says that individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So interactions, collaboration is one of the key things that we value. Don't also forget that Agile also focuses on a lot of collaboration. So people who should form part of your developers must have good communication skills as well as team working skills. So you need to make sure that these are people who have soft skills like communication skill and then ability to work in a team. You also need some specialists, but then more of generalists. So that's why when earlier on I said your developer should be more of generalists than specialists. For example, testers who can code. You also need developers that will make decisions and take responsibility for them. This, of course, would help you in promoting the right attitude and then also make it safe for people to make mistakes. And these are factors you need to put it into consideration, especially when it comes to forming your developers. So here we've taken a look at the role of the developers. I will say that developers are those who are responsible for the day-to-day operations that you have within the Scrum. your coding, your testing, your designs, and then also every other task that is carried out within the Scrum environment. And we did explain that it should be a cross-functional team, and then also that generalists are usually preferred over specialists when it comes to developers. And then we also went ahead to say that the developers should be self-managed, and then of course be able to take responsibility and also take decisions where necessary. And then also that communication and collaboration skill is a critical component of the developer skill, which of course every developer within the Scrum team should have. So next, we're going to be taking a look at some other stakeholders that you may have within the Scrum framework, say, for example, the manager, and then also some other specialist role. We'll see that in subsequent lessons. Thank you. All right, welcome back. So here we're going to take a look at the role of the manager. The truth of the matter is, within the Scrum lifecycle, the role of the manager does not exist. So the Scrum lifecycle does not mention manager at all. So please note that we don't have manager within Scrum. The team in Scrum is supposed to be self-managing. Self-managing simply means a decision is taken by everyone's input, and then most times based on consensus. And then if consensus is not reached, we can also decide on how best to take decisions where consensus is also not reached. And that's also another form of consensus. So the role of managing most times is supported by the Scrum Master. Don't forget, we're not saying the Scrum Master manages, but then we're saying that the team self-manages, guided by the Scrum Master. So the team takes directions from the product owner in terms of work needed. So the product owner manages the product backlog, prioritizes the items in the product backlog, and says these are items that have the highest values that should be implemented in the order of priority. And then the developers now pull work from the product backlog to now the sprint, and which of course will now form the sprint backlog that now determines what to be accomplished within that particular sprint. So you can see that the Scrum team is a self-sustaining, self-managing, and then also self-organized team. So the question now arises, what role may a functional or a line manager play within a Scrum environment? Well, if your organization is implementing Scrum, and then you have line managers. Of course, when we talk about functional and line managers, we're basically talking about heads of departments, say accounts, marketing, operations, and then the rest of them. So what role do they now play, especially when it comes to Scrum? Now, some of the roles that the manager actually plays, of course, would include recruiting the right members. So, for example, the HR, in many cases, will be responsible for recruiting within the Scrum environment. So that's one of the roles that managers can play. Then also be the mentor or coach for the team where necessary. Say, for example, in terms of coaching the team on organizations, policies, do's and don'ts, then manager can, of course, play a role. Then also in backlog refinement, say, for example, we need explanations on certain technical things, then the manager can also play a role. The manager can also bring the right culture into the team, essentially about enculturation, the right culture of the organization. Then help the team understand the big picture. So here you're now talking about things from a strategic perspective and giving an enterprise view to the organization, to the Scrum team about the organization. They can also help in developing skills, for example, determining relevant training. Say, for example, your HR can determine that we need to send our Scrum team to a CSM class or a PSM class, or maybe to buy, Balim's course, and then, of course, use it to train our team. So this can also be a decision that comes from the manager. And then they also administer rewards and recognition, then protect the team in prioritization battles, also deal with escalated issues, especially if there are issues in terms of escalation. Say, for example, if we have a situation where conflict arises to the extent that the team is not able to manage it and then is escalated, then of course, managers can also step in. They also keep abreast of technology, industry and business trends, and then prepare for the future. And they also may represent the team in external forums. It's just so you know, especially for organizing your team and your organization, especially if you're in a matrix organizational structure. The matrix organizational structure is simply a type of organizational structure that maintains functional roles. Say, for example, the core roles of accounting, marketing, HR. Those are what we refer to as functional roles. And then they also have what we refer to as a Scrum team. So that's what you call a matrix organizational structures. So you have the functional roles, and then you also have the Scrum team, as the case may be. So this is a matrix organizational structure. So the managers for this, functional unit can, of course, perform these functions as stipulated here. Recruitment and firing, this can, of course, come from the managers. See, for example, HR can recruit a particular developer and then also can decide to fire a developer when necessary. I mean, if there are reasons to, especially when it comes to things surrounding the policy, and then also play some of these other roles that you may have within the organization itself. Then beyond the role of the manager, you could also have what we call specialist roles. Of course, don't forget, like we said earlier on, every member of the team is referred to as a developer. So it doesn't matter which role that you occupy or carry out within the team itself. So in many cases, Scrum really does not make any distinction. However, based on specific needs, you may want to consider assigning specific roles. Say, for example, the role of an architect or automated tester or configuration manager. So this would, of course, be discussed within the developers, and then we say, okay, you can have the task of architecture, you can have the task of automated testing, and then you can have the task of coding, then you can have the task of configuration management. And that's exactly what we're saying here, that as a team, we can decide how best to organize ourselves into specific specialist roles where necessary in order to enable us to effectively deliver on the particular sprint goal, on that particular sprint goal. So here, we are taking a look at the role of the manager, and we say that in Scrum, we don't have manager. However, if you're within a matrix organizational structure, you may have external managers or heads of other departments, for example, HR, operations, IT, and the rest of them. And we'll take a look at some of the functions they can play, which of course can include recruiting and firing, remuneration, rewards, and then also some other functions. And then we also said that within the developers, we can, of course, decide specifically how to allocate tasks based on specialization. But this is not taking away the fact that in Scrum, generalist is usually preferred over specialist. However, where necessary, a task within the Scrum team has to be divided according to specialist roles. So this effectively brings us to the end of the topic that addresses Scrum roles. I hope this particular lesson has been quite informative for you. I want to thank you for listening, and then see you in the next lesson.